It took 100 years to build the British Empire. It took 7 days to destroy it. In November 1956, the British pound was the undisputed king of global money. It was as good as gold. But then, the Prime Minister picked up the phone and heard a threat from the United States that changed history instantly. The Americans didn't threaten war. They threatened to sell. They told Britain to withdraw its troops from Egypt, or the U.S. would dump its holdings of British pounds and bankrupt the country. By morning, Britain folded. The troops came home. And in that single week, the pound lost its crown, and the U.S. dollar took the throne it still holds today. Most people think the death of a superpower is a slow, decades-long fade. They imagine a gentle sunset, a graceful passing of the torch. They are wrong. History shows us that when the end comes, it happens violently and it happens fast. The decline may take generations, but the final collapse happens in days, sometimes hours. And if you look at the financial data coming out of the United States in early 2026, we are standing on the edge of that same cliff. The numbers are flashing red, the warning signs are everywhere, and almost nobody's paying attention. To understand 2026, we have to go back to 1914. Picture the world before the Great War. If you were a wealthy merchant in Shanghai, a banker in New York, or a trader in Buenos Aires, you kept your money in London. You didn't do it because you loved the British. You didn't do it out of loyalty or admiration. You did it because the pound was the global operating system. The British pound was backed by gold, real, physical gold, sitting in the vaults of the Bank of England. It was protected by the Royal Navy, the most powerful military force the world had ever seen. British law governed international contracts. British insurance companies underwrote global shipping. British banks financed the railways of Argentina, the mines of South Africa, and the factories of India. The pound wasn't just a currency, it was the infrastructure of global commerce. It felt invincible. But this is the first lesson history teaches us. Invincibility is a lie. By the time a country feels untouchable, the rot has usually already started. The peak of confidence is often the beginning of decline. In 1914, Britain controlled roughly 25% of the world's land surface. The sun literally never set on the British Empire. But beneath the flags and the fanfare, the foundations were cracking. The country was about to make a decision that would seal its fate. Not immediately, but inevitably. Britain decided to fight World War I on credit. Let me explain what that means. When Britain entered the Great War, the government believed it would be over by Christmas, a quick, decisive victory. They were catastrophically wrong. 4 years later, Britain had lost nearly 1 million men. The country had spent the equivalent of trillions of dollars in today's money, and they had done it by borrowing. Before the war, Britain was the world's largest creditor nation. Countries owed money to Britain. By 1918, Britain owed money to everyone, especially the United States. The country had literally sold its future to win the present. But here's the thing about debts. They don't disappear. They compound. And when you've mortgaged your empire to survive one war, you're in no position to fight another. Yet that's exactly what happened. 20 years later, Britain was back at war, this time against Nazi Germany. Once again, the country fought with borrowed money. Once again, the bills came from America. By 1945, Britain had won the war, but lost its financial independence. The country was technically bankrupt, surviving entirely on loans from the United States through programs like Lend-Lease and the Marshall Plan. And here is the catch. Here is the part that should terrify every American reading this. The British public didn't feel poor. In 1950s London, there was full employment. The National Health Service was brand new, providing free health care to everyone. The government was building hospitals and schools and council housing. Rationing had ended. Shops were full. To the average citizen walking down Oxford Street, the empire was still alive and well. But financially, it was a zombie. The appearance of prosperity was masking a corpse. How does a bankrupt nation maintain the illusion of wealth? The same way empires always do, through financial engineering and the exploitation of trust. The British government was printing money to pay its debts, not openly, not honestly, but through 1,000 small mechanisms that added up to the same thing. The result was inflation simmering under the surface. Prices rose slowly, year after year, eating away at savings, eroding the purchasing power of wages. But the real trick was something called the sterling area. After World War II, Britain couldn't compete with American manufacturing. They couldn't export their way to prosperity. So instead, they built a financial prison for their former colonies. Countries like India, Australia, New Zealand, and dozens of others were required to keep their foreign reserves in British pounds. They were required to conduct trade in sterling. They were, in effect, forced to buy British debt. Britain essentially forced its partners to finance its lifestyle. The colonies were funding the mother country's decline. Does that sound familiar? For the last 40 years, the United States has run massive deficits, trade deficits, budget deficits, deficits piled upon deficits. And who has financed them? China, Japan, Saudi Arabia, and dozens of other countries who buy American treasury bonds. We assumed they did it because they liked us. We assumed they did it because they believed in the American system. We assumed the dollar's dominance was a reflection of our virtue. Britain assumed the same thing. They thought they could print money forever, spend it on a military they couldn't afford, maintain a global presence they could no longer justify, and the rest of the world would just absorb the inflation. They thought the colonies would keep buying their debt out of habit, out of inertia, out of a lack of alternatives. It worked for a while, until the math met reality. For the pound sterling, the reality check came in 1956. It came in a place most Americans have never heard of, the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal is a narrow waterway connecting the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea. It cuts through Egypt, and it was, and still is, one of the most important trade routes in the world. Ships carrying oil from the Persian Gulf, goods from Asia, commodities from Africa, they all passed through Suez. Controlling that canal meant controlling global commerce. For decades, the canal had been run by a company controlled by Britain and France. Egypt was technically independent, but the canal was theirs. Then, in July 1956, the Egyptian president, Gamal Abdel Nasser, did something that shocked the world. He nationalized the canal. He took it back. Britain was outraged. This was an insult. This was unacceptable. This was a challenge to the natural order of things. And so Britain, along with France and Israel, decided to invade. They would take the canal back by force. They would show the world that the British Empire was still a power to be reckoned with. Militarily, the operation was a success. British and French troops seized the canal zone within days. Egyptian forces were routed. Victory seemed assured, but financially they were being slaughtered. Investors around the world looked at Britain, a country deep in debt, running massive deficits, now fighting a new war it couldn't afford, and they panicked. They started selling pounds and buying dollars. They started pulling their money out of London. The Bank of England burned through its gold reserves trying to save the currency. They were selling gold, spending their emergency funds, doing everything possible to maintain the pound's value. But they were bleeding cash at a rate that would bankrupt the nation in weeks. The mathematics were brutal. At the rate reserves were depleting, Britain would be insolvent before Christmas. And then the phone call came. President Eisenhower was furious. The United States had not been consulted about the invasion. America was trying to win hearts and minds in the Cold War, and here were the British acting like 19th century colonialists. Eisenhower delivered an ultimatum: withdraw immediately, or the United States would sell its own holdings of British pounds. The British couldn't survive that. They knew it. Everyone knew it. If America sold, other countries would sell, the pound would collapse, Britain would face a financial crisis that made the Great Depression look mild. Britain withdrew, in humiliation, in disgrace. They were defeated not by an army, but by a margin call. This was the moment the world knew the pound was dead. It wasn't the currency of a leader anymore. It was the currency of a debtor, a vassal, a dependent. You would think that after such a humiliation, the government would fix the finances. They would cut spending. They would pay down debt. They would rebuild reserves. They would face reality. They didn't. And this is where the story gets terrifyingly similar to where we are right now. After 1956, the British political class went into denial. Both parties, Conservative and Labour, spent the next decade pretending everything was fine. The pound was still pegged at an artificially high value against the dollar. To maintain that peg, they kept interest rates painfully high. They begged for short-term loans from other countries. They imposed capital controls to prevent money from leaving. They called this defending the pound, but what they were really doing was prolonging the agony. They were choosing slow decline over honest restructuring. They were protecting their pride at the expense of their future. Now fast forward to January 2026. Listen to the language coming out of Washington. Listen carefully. We hear about a soft landing. The Federal Reserve has supposedly engineered a miraculous outcome where inflation is tamed without a recession. Everything is under control. We hear that the $38 trillion debt doesn't matter because we owe it to ourselves. As if that changes anything. As if the interest payments aren't real. We hear that the dollar is strong because there is no alternative. We hear that the dollar will remain dominant forever because no other currency can match it. That phrase, "there is no alternative," was the mantra of the British in the 1960s. The politicians, the bankers, the economists, they all said it. They couldn't imagine a world without the pound at the center. They couldn't imagine anyone challenging their position. They didn't realize that alternatives are created the moment the incumbent becomes a liability. Alternatives don't exist until they do. And then suddenly, they're everywhere. In the 1960s, the alternative was the euro-dollar market, a system of dollar-denominated deposits held outside the United States, beyond the reach of American regulators. It emerged in the shadows, and within a decade, it had transformed global finance. Today, in 2026, we see central banks buying gold at record paces. We see countries like China and Russia conducting trade in their own currencies. We see the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and their expanding membership, piloting digital ledger systems designed to bypass the dollar entirely. The alternatives are being built in the shadows, just waiting for the giant to stumble. The stumble for Britain finally came in 1967. By then, the pretense was getting harder to maintain. The economy was stagnant, the trade deficit was widening. Other countries were losing patience. Speculators smelled blood. They started betting against the pound again, borrowing sterling, selling it for dollars, waiting for the collapse. The government spent billions trying to hold the line. They raised interest rates to punishing levels. They borrowed from anyone who would lend. They tried every trick they knew. But on November 18, 1967, they capitulated. They devalued the currency. The pound dropped from 280 to 240, a 14% devaluation. Overnight, every person in Britain became 14% poorer on the global stage. Everything imported became more expensive. Every foreign debt became larger. Every British tourist abroad found their money worth less. The next day, Prime Minister Harold Wilson went on television. He looked into the camera and delivered one of the most infamous lies in financial history. It does not mean that the pound here in Britain, in your pocket or purse, has been devalued. It was a lie. Of course it had been devalued. That was the entire point. The pound in your pocket looked the same color, same design, same numbers, but it bought significantly less. Imports became expensive. Gas prices rose. Food costs increased. And the standard of living began a decline that would last a decade. This is exactly what a soft default looks like. It's not a dramatic bankruptcy. It's not a refusal to pay. It's a quiet theft, a reduction in purchasing power that affects everyone who holds the currency. And it is likely the path the United States is on today. The politicians won't call it a default. They'll call it a necessary adjustment. They'll call it flexibility. They'll call it market forces. But the result is the same. Your money buys less, your savings shrink, and the government's debts become easier to pay. But the final nail in the coffin didn't come until 1976. By then, Britain was known as the sick man of Europe. The economy was in shambles. Inflation hit 24%. Unemployment soared. Labor strikes paralyzed the country. The government literally ran out of cash to pay basic obligations, police salaries, teacher pensions, hospital budgets. They had no choice. They had to go to the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and beg for a bailout. The IMF agreed to lend Britain $3.9 billion, but there were conditions. Brutal conditions. The IMF forced Britain to slash public spending. They demanded cuts to social programs. They required austerity measures that affected millions of people. Imagine that. A former superpower, the nation that defeated Napoleon, the nation that ruled a quarter of the world. That nation was being told how much it could spend on school lunches by a committee of accountants in Washington. This is the ultimate nightmare scenario for the United States. Not an explosion, not a dramatic collapse, a loss of sovereignty. A world where our creditors dictate our domestic policy. A world where we cannot choose our own budget because we are too indebted to those who hold our bonds. So, where is the United States today? We are squarely between the denial phase and the collapse phase. Look at the numbers. The national debt has crossed $38 trillion. It's growing by roughly $1 trillion every 100 days. The trajectory is not linear, it's exponential. For the first time in history, interest payments on that debt are higher than our entire defense budget. Let that sink in. We are spending more to service our past than to defend our future. That is the mathematical definition of a debt spiral. When your interest payments exceed your investments, you're not growing, you're dying. We are also overextended. Just like Britain in 1956, the United States is managing conflicts and commitments in multiple regions with a military that is stretched thin. Our weapon stockpiles have been depleted. Our manufacturing base has atrophied. The spirit is willing, but the wallet is weak, and we have already weaponized the currency. When the United States seized Russian foreign assets in 2022, when we cut Russia off from the SWIFT payment system, we sent a message to every country in the world. That message was, the dollar is not neutral. The dollar is a weapon, and weapons can be turned on anyone. That decision accelerated the move to gold. It accelerated the search for alternatives. Central banks aren't selling all their dollars yet. That would crash their own portfolios. But they are heading for the exit. They are reducing their exposure. They are diversifying into gold, into other currencies, into anything that can't be frozen by a decision in Washington. So how does it end? It likely won't be a war. It won't be an invasion. It won't be a dramatic confrontation. It will be a Treasury auction. Picture a Tuesday morning later this year. The U.S. Treasury needs to sell $100 billion in bonds to pay the bills. This happens regularly. It's how the government finances its operations. Normally it's routine. The bonds sell, the money comes in, the machine keeps running. But this time, the buyers don't show up. Foreign central banks, who usually purchase a significant portion, decide to sit it out. Domestic buyers are nervous. The auction is uncovered. More bonds offered than bids received. What happens next? The interest rate spikes. If you can't sell bonds at 4%, you have to offer 5%, then 6%, then 7%. Each increase makes the debt more expensive. Each increase drains more money from the budget. The stock market panics. Investors see the spike in rates and realize what it means. They sell. The market drops. Confidence evaporates. The Federal Reserve is forced to step in. They become the buyer of last resort, printing trillions of dollars to purchase the bonds that nobody else wants. This is called monetizing the debt. It's what Argentina does. It's what Zimbabwe did. It's the last resort of failing empires. And when you print trillions of dollars, you get inflation. Not 3% inflation, not 5% inflation. You get inflation that destroys savings, inflation that devastates retirees, inflation that makes the dollar in your pocket worth less every single day. That is how the reserve status dies, not with a bang, but with a no bid. The story of the British pound is a tragedy, but it is also a lesson. Britain didn't disappear. The country still exists. London is still a major financial center. The British people adapted. They learned to live within their means. They became a normal country, prosperous by global standards, but no longer exceptional. What vanished was the exorbitant privilege, the ability to print the world's money, the ability to run deficits without consequences, the ability to consume more than you produce because the rest of the world has no choice but to accept your currency. That privilege is worth trillions of dollars. It subsidizes our standard of living. It allows our government to spend without taxing. It lets us import more than we export, year after year, decade after decade. When that privilege ends, and it will end, American life will change. Not apocalyptically, but profoundly. Things will cost more. Choices will be harder. The easy assumptions of the past will no longer apply. For you, the lesson is simple. Do not bet your financial future on the status quo. If you are holding all your wealth in a single currency, you're betting that history will not repeat itself. You are betting that this time is different. You're betting that the United States is somehow immune to the forces that have humbled every empire before it. The British merchant in 1914, confident in the eternal dominance of the pound. The bondholder in 1956, shocked when his safe investment became worthless. The saver in 1967, watching his purchasing power evaporate while politicians told him nothing had changed. They all thought it was different. They were all wrong. The transition from the dollar to whatever comes next has already begun. We don't know the winner yet. It might be gold. It might be a basket of currencies. It might be something digital we haven't yet imagined. But we know who the loser will be. The loser is the person who ignores the ticking clock. The loser is the person who assumes tomorrow will look like yesterday. The loser is the person who trusts politicians when they say the money in your pocket hasn't been devalued. I'm the wealthy